So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Richard. I'm the Director for the Office of Faculty Enhancement. And today we're going to talk about how to lead good discussions in the classroom and in the online setting. We have Leslie Kaplan, who's going to talk. She's from the Honors Program, and she has some really interesting ways of helping students engage in discussion. She'll be sharing that with you. And then also Rosie Parlett from the Center for Instruction and Research Technology here at UNF, and she'll be sharing how to get students engaged in an online setting, engaged in discussion in an online setting. So with that, I'll turn things over to Leslie.
Okay. Hi, everybody. How you all doing?
Pretty good.
Good. I think it's important, one thing that I think is really important is to think about what the purpose of discussion is. My background is in literature or in writing classes, I guess, and social sciences. And so I've had different challenges in the different kinds of classes. In the writing classes, they're all discussion-based. And the students, though, have some difficulty understanding why they should be discussing because they're getting graded almost solely on their writing. And so they don't invest very much in the discussions. And it took me a while to start to figure out, well, why do I have so much discussion when, in fact, maybe it would be better to be an online class and do it all writing, since writing is what it's about. But as I thought about it more, what I realized is that in writing, one of the goals that I have as a writing teacher is to get them to use their critical thinking. And that's actually something that I can see the process of while we're talking. And so what I realized with that class was that my goal with the discussion was to hear them think and to help them see ways to think more clearly. And so I changed the way I started doing my discussion and started making that connection between what was happening in the class discussion and what they're being graded on much more explicit. It was always implicit in my understanding, but I had never said it out loud because it's just kind of a given. It's the way I was taught, so I was doing what I was taught. But what I realized is that if I start saying, so we're going to spend a lot of time in discussion because in discussion we're going to be working on these critical thinking, which is going to be a large part of what I'm grading you on your paper. That helped them. And then as I would have the discussions, I would say, so somebody would give me an idea and I would say, great idea. That could be a paper topic. That could be a thesis. How do we turn it from an idea into a thesis? And then I would have these like little mini, I would just grab an opportunity and turn it into a little mini discussion about paper writing. And sometimes I would take it all the way to, okay, so if that's going to be, we've got our thesis now, how would we, what kind of evidence might we use for it? And I would ask them to actually like read me quotes from their books. And then collect the evidence. Okay, how would we organize this? And we basically, I called it oral paper writing. And when I started doing that, I got a lot more discussion because the students invested more because they finally understood what the point was. And it also helped their papers get a lot better because they started applying what I thought we were all practicing into the actual writing, and everything got better. So one of the first keys, I think, in discussion, and this is probably true whether you're doing it online or whether you're doing it face-to-face, is to think about what's the goal of the discussion, and then thinking about how do we structure a discussion that gets at that goal. So for instance, I also take students abroad, and I want them to talk with, I take them to Greece, and I want them to talk with the Greek students, and there my goal is to get them to kind of help structure they're awkward. That's the first thing, right? So I got to break through that ice. I got to help them break through that ice. And then the second thing is to try to turn those discussions into something productive and help them see the productive places. So for instance, I've had some really good success with students in Greece talking about comparing. Basically what I ask them to do is I ask them to first gather evidence. What do you guys do in your social time? What do you guys do in your social time? Okay, how are these things different? Okay, what does that say about the two cultures? So it's fairly easy to say, what would you guys do for fun with your friends? Okay, what would you guys do for fun with your friends? And let them kind of talk, and that kind of breaks the ice. And then move it to the next level and say, I'm hearing differences. Do you guys hear those differences? Can we talk about them? And then start getting them in a more cross-cultural discussion. So again, thinking about what the point is really helpful. I wanted to I created a little handout for you that I thought would be helpful. And on one side, it has, I started thinking about critical thinking. I started thinking about critical thinking as we've been doing on campus quite a lot through our general education exploration. So turn to the side that says critical thinking skills. And one of the things for me about discussion is that it's often the place where you can have critical thinking in your courses. And again, it's because you're there live with them seeing the process. So I started thinking about, well, what do we mean by critical thinking? Again, inspired by some of the things we've been doing in the general education program. And I did some research, and this list is a list of the different kinds of critical thinking that I found valuable. And so I started thinking then about what kinds of questions might lead to these kinds of critical thinking, and then where would I use them in classes? So for instance, when I'm in Greece and trying to get Greek students and American students, it's that perspective taking that I'm after. When I'm teaching writing, it's the argument piece or maybe evaluation that I'm after. In some of my other classes, where I'm having the students I teach a social science class on immigration and national identity that has a lot of pieces that aren't necessarily immediately clear what the connection is to the students. And so we work really hard on what I call synthesis, which is under creative thinking there. And so I'll have a lot of questions that ask them to connect. Okay, there's this and there's this. How are they similar? How are they different? How do they connect? And ask those kinds of questions. So thinking about what it is that I'm trying to do in the classroom first, and then thinking about what kinds of questions second seemed to me to be a really effective way to guide a discussion. So if you flip your page to the other side, at the top, I've given you a little chart about types of questions. And this was really interesting because one of the classes that I teach is a facilitation class where I'm trying to teach sophomores, juniors, and seniors who are going to be in pairs effectively running a discussion section once a week with freshmen. So they're maybe only a year older. And they don't necessarily have a great grasp of the material. And so I've been trying to figure out how can I make use of those students. And in the course of talking about discussion with them, and I found it very valuable because they have a completely different experience with it because they were on the other side. So hearing that perspective that I have completely forgotten because it was 30 years ago is really helpful to me. And so in the context with them, we came up with this list of different kinds of questions because I was trying to help them figure out how can they run a good discussion in their classes. And so we came up with sometimes part of what we're trying to do is just connect the students to the material. And that might be the way to start when you're having to get them, when you're having trouble getting them to talk at all. And so just, what, when, who are the kinds of things that are fairly easy to answer and can get the ball rolling. Questions that connect to their experience. What experiences have you had that make you think that? Or does this connect to anything in your own lives? And those, again, are fairly easy to talk about. And then moving into other more critical thinking focused kinds of questions later. And then we also talked about what's the role of the facilitator in the discussion because I have a tendency to launch into a mini lecture because I know this stuff and I've got some idea in my head and I'm excited about it. And so talking to them about, instead of that, asking clarifying questions, playing devil's advocate, and those sorts of things. And so this is a list of different categories of questions, examples, and then in what context might you use them, which the students found really helpful for organizing in advance what kind of discussion they will have, and then what kinds of questions might they ask. And I think in what you guys were saying about the focus issue, that can be helpful because the problem, I think, for me at least, is I want them to focus, and I want to bring them back on topic, but I don't want to shut them down. And so it's that sort of balance. And so thinking about what kinds of questions can help focus. In my field, a lot of times what I need to do is they've gone off on a tangent and it's all like way up in the sky and disconnected from any evidence, and I want them to, because I'm always trying to do thesis evidence. So I'm always trying to bring them back, like, so how do you know that? What makes you think that? Was there a quote that said that? So I'm interested, I'm engaged with their ideas, I'm not changing the subject, I'm not shutting them down, but I'm finding a way to kind of bring it back down to earth where I need it to be. Having those ideas in your head, even as the discussion is going, you can be thinking about, okay, I need to bring them down to earth, let me ask them about evidence, and so that even in the midst of a discussion, you can kind of adapt to it. The other part that I have on the handout is the creative techniques to engage in direct discussion. And again, this is a list that I came up with the help of my students. And they have some really creative ideas about getting people to talk and making sure. One of the things that we're trying to do in that class, because it's a freshman class, is I want to get them used to talking at all, because there are a lot of students who are really quiet. I want them to get to your level and still be quiet. I want them to have broken through that on their own. So I emphasize for my freshmen trying to figure out ways to get everybody to talk. And so they've come up with a bunch of ways to incentivize people to talk more. And then you can combine that with the types of questions you have so that you both have full engagement of the class and also a fairly focused discussion. They've come up with, so one of them is humor. The students really use a lot of humor in getting each other to talk. So one of them is this random ways to choose other students to talk. So the next person who blinks needs to say something. The next person who yawns. The next phone I see out. Those kinds of things can be a way to choose who's going to talk next without shutting people down because it's funny, instead of, oh my God, she's picking on me, I have to talk again. They've done really fun things with point systems or competitions. So I've seen ones where they will say, okay, you guys get 5 points for that answer. And then the next one, they won't even say anything, but the next group, so they've got each group up on the board with their points, and this one gets a diamond shape. Nobody knows what that diamond shape means. And the next one gets a picture of a dinosaur. And so they're getting feedback. And one of the ways that I saw, one student facilitator was running the discussion and doing the follow-up questions and choosing who to talk. The other one was giving feedback on the board, sometimes funny, sometimes serious, but silently. He didn't say a word. He just drew things on the board and was using a different channel to give feedback. So the woman was asking questions and follow-ups, and then the guy was drawing pictures, and it encouraged them to talk. So at one point, one table had not said a word, and so he just drew a big circle around the empty space there. Everybody else has all this stuff, and this one doesn't. And they talked. They rose to it because he didn't have to say a word. He didn't really call them out. He just drew a little bit of attention to it. The popcorn method is where you have some kind of an object and you give it to one person, and then it's their job to give it to the next one and the next one. And that can be helpful because one of the things that I find in discussions is that how do you decide who to call on next? That's always an issue. I typically use first come, first serve. Not really the most sensible way, but again, I just never thought about it. Sometimes it can be helpful to have them decide who's going to talk next. That takes the pressure off of you. If you're trying to get them to talk at all, then you're not the bad guy who's making the shy person talk. It's they who are deciding it. And so the popcorn method, I give it to you, you decide who to give it to, and people pass it around. And they will typically send it around fairly randomly. It tends to get all the way around. Somebody at the end will notice that person's never had it and it's his turn. So if your goal is to get them just to talk, that can be an effective way to do it. And that leaves you free to be paying more attention to the dynamics of the discussion rather than trying to decide, okay, who had their hand raised the longest. Another one, again, to try to get full Participation is there's candy, and every time you talk, you get to take a piece of candy, or you have 3 cards, you have to put down a card. One of the difficulties in discussions is you've got one kid who talks a lot and one kid who doesn't talk at all. This kind of thing can balance it. If you know you only have 3 cards, you save it till your 3 best things. You don't just talk every single time. And then the one who has difficulty talking feels the pressure as the day rolls on and they're still holding all of their cards. The students started doing a really interesting one, and this might be my favorite, and it's evolved over about the course of 3 years. Each group of facilitators has made it, has refined it. But what they do is they take playing cards or something. They take some kind of cards. They've used it as playing cards where it's the face cards, and each of the different cards has a different role. And they hand them out, or else they just make their own little cards with the word connector or devil's advocate, and they hand them out seemingly randomly, but typically they're not random. So they might have a student who talks a lot is silenced. They don't get to talk until the second round or something. And the roles are a connector, which is somebody who has to make connections between topics, a devil's advocate, which is pretty obvious, somebody who's silenced or not allowed to talk, somebody who has to start a discussion, who has to start a new line of discussion. And so they started aligning some of the roles with this list of types of questions, which I thought was really interesting. And then what they were thinking about doing was starting a class, the first maybe 3 or 4 classes, using that method. And then what it does is it both encourages everybody to talk, sets the standard that everybody will talk, but also starts helping students think about what the roles are, because sometimes when students aren't talking, it's because they don't know what's going to be useful to say. And students get as irritated as we do sometimes when we're off topic and then that kid just keeps talking on forever about something that isn't relevant. But sometimes even that kid who's doing that, he's trying to participate, he doesn't know how. And so the idea about helping the students figure out what kinds of questions lead to good discussions by having them play those roles and then saying, okay, we've done that card game 3 times, we're going to dispense with it, but when you're making comments, remember those categories. And now they've heard them and seen how effective they can be in creating discussions, which I thought was just a terrific idea and one that I'm stealing from my students, going to use with my next group. Then there's other ones, discussion board roulette. This is a community building one where one student picks another student. The second student reads the question. The first one answers it. Sometimes we'll have required discussion questions. One of the things that I observed as I was teaching these writing classes is that my students are not very good necessarily at coming up with theses. They don't have great, clear ideas about what they're reading, but they're actually really good at asking questions, at noticing where there are problems. And so sometimes what I'll do is I'll have weekly discussion questions. I don't write them, they write them. So I say, you're looking for something that doesn't make sense, something that doesn't follow, something that you have a real question about. And then when I get them, you have to do, 3 per chapter or something like that. And then when I get them, I have them hand them in to me, and then I'll just make some notes. A check means it was fine. If I can answer it in a 1 word, like no or yes, it wasn't a great question, isn't going to start a discussion. So again, having them figure out what kinds of questions lead to good discussions is the same skill as what kinds of questions lead to good paper answers, because it means they were complex enough. And so they're getting written feedback on their written questions, and then what I do in the classroom is I say, okay, get in groups of 3, look at, you had 3 questions per chapter, you now have 9 questions per chapter, pick 1 question out of those 9 that you think is going to be the most interesting discussion, write that on the board, and then I get this array of questions on the board, and as they're writing them, I'm thinking about what order I want to answer them in. That's really my job, is to order them. And then we kind of go through, and I'll say, okay, let's start with this one. These 3 seem to connect together. these lead to this one, seems to be a cause and effect thing, so we're going to take it in that order. And then we go through the discussions. They're more invested in the discussion because the questions came from them. But there's not that pressure of, oh my God, I have to talk and I'm afraid to talk. They've had time to see each other's questions and see, oh gosh, I've never had one of my questions picked, but that one always does. Those questions are good because these are the kinds of answers that we get. That's a very effective method, both to get them to talk, to have the confidence, and to make that connection between spoken discussion and graded work. The Jigsaw Method is another one that I really like, which is basically you take a large body of material and you have each group responsible for a piece of it. So maybe I'm trying to figure out what the connection is between a series of chapters in a story. And so I'll give you your table one chapter, and your table another chapter, and your table another chapter. And then your goal is to give me a little summary of what that chapter is about. Each group gives their summary, so they're all doing something different. And then we ask, okay, what's the connection between them? You've all given me your little summaries. Now how do we put them back together? So it's jigsaw because it's a puzzle that we've broken apart and then we put back together. And that's also an effective route. Another one is, and this is another one that I came up with the students that I found really interesting, that question of how do you choose who to speak next? I tend to use first come, first serve. It's fair, but it's not very effective because by the time I've gotten to person number 3, person number 4 was inspired by something person 1 said, and I'm out of order. So I've started trying to find ways, and this is something that I think was actually inspired by seeing some of the things that we do on online classes where you can be talking, but there's a chat going at the same time. And so suddenly I can see who's got the idea that must come next because I can skim the chat while I'm leading the discussion. And so I was trying to figure out, is there a way to do that in real-time classes, in face-to-face classes? And one is to just ask them, okay, we've got 5 hands up, who really needs to go next? Or having some kind of a signal if what you say needs to go next versus something that maybe could wait either because we've already left the topic or because it's a new topic or something like that. And so I'll just stop and say, we got a lot of hands up, who needs to go next? Who's changing the topic? Who's connecting to this topic? So I take 20 seconds to organize it, and then we continue the discussion. And then we'll stop again, 20 seconds to organize it, and then we continue the discussion. Another way to do that, which I haven't tried yet, but I think might work, would be to have students either while we're in the middle of talking, come write something on the board, or write something on a piece of paper and send them up. There's got to be some way to give whoever is standing up there, or to have appoint a student to collect the little pieces of paper where the students are writing something down about what their topic is, and then they can feed me the papers and say, this one, this is the one that needs to go next. And so there might be better ways, and that way you can keep a really good discussion going and not have that Frankenstein walk as you lurch this direction and then you lurch that direction. So those are just a kind of range of different ways of thinking about it. I think the kind of overall consideration that I'm suggesting here is being more thoughtful and deliberate about what our goals are and what methods we're using to get discussion going, and then that will lead us towards a lot of these creative and innovative ideas. And then the last one I would suggest is talk with your students, because often they can give you valuable ideas that you wouldn't have come up with. A lot of those really unusual ones are things that came from this collaboration between the students and myself. And if you have a class that's not talking, either ask them, I don't know whether it would work in discussion since they're not talking, but maybe even getting them to write about why not, or talk about why it's important, like basically involving them in figuring out how to make this work better and be more worth their time. Any questions or comments?